The fire is already lit. Sit down, breathe, and listen. There is no coming to consciousness without pain. Carl Gustav Jung. They call it a spiritual awakening, but no one tells you what really happens when it begins. It's not peace. It's not light. It's disorientation. It's when everything that once gave you a name starts to fall apart. Suddenly, roles, goals, even love all feel artificial, as if you had been living inside a dream. And now, finally awake, you can't go back. But awakening is not liberating. It's brutal. It's the collapse of the narrative you used to survive. And that's why most people don't survive their own awakening. Not because they die physically, but because the ego doesn't know how to live after the illusion dissolves. In this video, you'll understand why a true awakening doesn't set you free, it tears you apart. What happens when the ego begins to crumble, and how to walk through the dark night of the soul, not by fleeing the shadow, but by inviting it to sit beside you. The first question is not how to awaken, but are you truly willing to let everything that isn't real die? Awakening is not a mystical event. It's a rupture. A rupture with the identity you spent your whole life building, with inherited meanings, with the psychic structure that kept you functional. And that's why so many give up, because what comes first is not relief, it's collapse. The structure of the self must fall so something more authentic can emerge. But the ego was never made to be dismantled. It was made to protect. It organizes the world, interprets experiences, shapes your inner narrative. And when awakening begins, all of that becomes obsolete. You still breathe, but you no longer know who you are. You still move, but without direction. You still speak, but nothing you say feels true. This is the point many confuse with depression, with pathological disorientation. And sometimes it is, but not always. There are moments when collapse is not a disease. It is a legitimate psychic revolt against a way of living that is no longer bearable. It's the unconscious demanding space. It's the shadow refusing to stay repressed. Carl Jung understood this well. He said that awakening is not about becoming enlightened. It's about bringing light into the darkness within. And that process hurts. Because what was hidden is not soft. It's raw. It's ancient. It's visceral. The pain of awakening doesn't come from a new wound. It comes from the encounter with what was always there, but you avoid it. The awakening crisis begins when the narrative of your life loses its meaning. You realize that everything you believed to be solid, your certainties, your goals, even your faith, was built to avoid a central question. Who am I when everything that defined me stops making sense? And that question doesn't arrive loudly. It invades. It erodes the ground beneath your feet. It's not about conscious rebellion. It's a symbolic collapse. The moment when adapting to the outer world comes at too high a price internally. You begin to feel that something is deeply wrong. Even if on the outside, everything seems right. And then comes the exile. Not imposed, but spontaneous. You withdraw from conversations, from ambitions, from roles that no longer fit. Not because you want to, but because you can no longer participate in the lie. The social lie, the emotional lie, the spiritual lie that says being okay means adapting at any cost. This is the point many turn back, because the discomfort of continuing is immense, and no one teaches you what to do when your symbolic ground disappears. Jung called it the dark night of the soul, a transitional period when the ego can no longer sustain the old, but the new has not yet been formed.
And this is where courage is required, not to advance, but not to flee. Because it is in the staying that transformation begins, not in the search for quick answers, but in the capacity to hold the emptiness until something true reveals itself. The ego is not the villain, it is a necessary construction. It's how the psyche functions in a world where being yourself is not always safe. From an early age, you learned to adapt, to respond to what was expected of you, to avoid what brought rejection, to emphasize what brought approval. And it works for a while. But there comes a moment when that adapted self begins to suffocate, not because it's wrong, but because it's no longer enough. It protected you, but now it holds you back. Most people think of ego as arrogance, but really, ego is made of fear. Fear of rejection, fear of losing control, fear of being seen fully. And when awakening happens, what crumbles first is that defensive structure. Grand ambitions start to lose meaning. Relationships you kept out of convenience begin to fall apart. Even your deepest values no longer seem to fit. This is not failure. It's the necessary dismantling. The ego cannot handle the real because the real offers no guarantees. The real cannot be controlled. The real doesn't promise validation. The real demands presence. And presence, for someone who has spent a lifetime defending themselves, is unbearable at first. That's why Jung said bringing the unconscious to light is not a comfortable path. It's a process of erosion. Everything non-essential begins to crumble. You cannot stay intact and awaken at the same time. A choice must be made. Either you preserve the safe version of yourself, or you allow it to be undone so something more real can emerge. The collapse of the ego doesn't happen all at once. It seeps in. It begins with small inconsistencies. You realize you're surrounded by things you never chose. There are relationships you maintained out of fear, goals you chased out of habit, habits you kept for identity, not truth. And then something within you refuses. No matter how much you try to maintain external control, internally, it no longer makes sense. At this point, most people try to rationalize. They search for explanations, consult experts, change habits, change bodies, change their surroundings. But what's asking for change isn't behavioral. It's structural. You don't just need to reorganize the house. You need to recognize that the house was built on a foundation that no longer represents you. And the ego resists. It tries to bargain with the process. I'll change, but without losing my reputation. I'll grow, but without dismantling my certainties. I'll awaken, but without giving up comfort. It doesn't work, because awakening demands everything the ego fears most: uncertainty, solitude, silence. Carl Jung stated that the unconscious doesn't want to destroy you, it wants to make you whole. But to do that, what is false must fall. What is functional but not true must dissolve. It's not about rejecting the ego, but understanding that it cannot lead the process. It must yield. Because what is trying to emerge is not a better self, It's a more real self, without armor, without spiritual makeup, without the need for approval. And that, for someone who spent a lifetime trying to fit in, feels like death. But in truth, it's the first sign of life. After the ego begins to give way, something even deeper happens: the collapse of meaning. The words that once motivated you now sound hollow. The references that once guided you lose their value. And the worst part? Neither the old certainties nor the new pursuits seem to make sense. It's as if reality itself has been deprogrammed. You see the same scenarios, but nothing holds the symbolic weight it once held. The names you gave to things, success, love, spirituality, purpose, no longer fit. Not because you stopped believing, but because something within you stopped accepting ready-made meanings. This is the most dangerous point of the process, because the collapse of meaning brings a real risk: existential emptiness. And in this emptiness, many confuse awakening with disintegration. But they are not the same. Disintegration is destruction without direction. Awakening is a rupture with purpose. It is the natural process of emptying what was saturated with others' expectations, so that new meaning can be born from within. Jung pointed out that the human being needs meaning as much as bread, and when old meaning dies, a period of disorientation is inevitable. But that disorientation is not a mistake. It's part of the path. It's the symbolic limbo between who you were and who you don't yet know you can become. That name is the crossing. During the crossing, a silence arises that is hard to bear. It's not the outer silence, but the inner one. The one that arrives when all your automatic answers stop working. You wake up and no longer know what you're seeking. What once moved you, status, recognition, even spiritual growth, now sounds like noise. And the attempt to fill this silence with activity, productivity, or even knowledge fails. Because the void doesn't want to be filled. It wants to be acknowledged. This is the point where the old self can no longer maintain control, and the new one doesn't yet know how to speak. You feel the absence of meaning not as drama, but as diagnosis. Life as it was has become uninhabitable. But the new way of living hasn't yet revealed its architecture. Jung described this as a state of symbolic death, a psychic interval between identities where the old meaning has dissolved and the new is still germinating in the dark. The danger here is the rushed return. Many, faced with this abyss of meaning, rush to rebuild a new ego with a different face, spiritual, intellectual, positive. But the essence remains absent, because awakening is not about swapping masks. It's about no longer needing them. True reconstruction only begins when you stop running from the absence and decide finally to sit with it. It's at this point that the shadow appears, not as a monster outside of you, but as everything you tried not to be. The anger you denied, the envy you repressed, the fear you rationalized, the pain you spiritualized. It all returns, not to punish you, but to be integrated. Jung wrote, "Enlightenment does not occur by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And that's exactly what awakening demands: the courage to face what you've spent a lifetime avoiding in yourself. The shadow is everything that was excluded from your identity, but it doesn't disappear. It turns into compulsive behaviors, emotional sabotage, repeated patterns. It hides in your most intense reactions, in triggers you can't explain, in choices you feel are wrong, yet you repeat them as if you had no choice. And when you stop running, it approaches. Not gently, but urgently. It demands presence, because only then can it be seen not as a threat, but as part of you, part of your story, part of your complexity, part of your power. The most common mistake is trying to heal the shadow as if it were a flaw. But it doesn't need to be healed, it needs to be heard. True maturity is not about becoming light, it's about holding the paradox, being light and shadow, being noble and contradictory, being human, whole. This is where real transformation begins, not by fleeing the pain, but through the radical willingness to face it with open eyes.
What comes after facing the shadow is not lightness, it's mourning. Not for the past, but for yourself, for the version of you that will not return. This is the second pain, more subtle, more solitary, and for many, harder to accept than the initial pain of collapse, because now you know. You've seen what was behind the illusion. You've understood that you can no longer go back to who you were. But that doesn't mean you know who you're becoming. And this transition is brutal. You no longer have anywhere to lean. The old references no longer serve. The new ones haven't arrived. You're in the interval between the end of one identity and the birth of another. And that interval is called exile. Exile from your certainties. Exile from the connections that didn't follow your process. Exile from the social image you maintained. This is where many feel lost. But they are not lost. They are in mutation. What hurts is not being aimless. It's being without identity. Because the old one has been dismantled. And the new one has no name, no form, no approval. Jung said the process of individuation requires the abandonment of all that is not essential. But no one tells you that in doing so, you'll feel groundless. And this is the dilemma. You want to move forward, but you still grieve what you left behind. This is the new crisis. You no longer suffer for not knowing the truth. Now you suffer because you know it. And knowing demands a constant choice to stay even when everything in you wants to flee. You enter the void. It's not a physical place, it's an internal condition, a state in which no idea feels sufficient, no plan fits, no answer holds for long. And the worst part? No one around you seems to notice. You keep fulfilling tasks, speaking normally, maybe even smiling. But inside, you are suspended. Life goes on, but you're no longer in it the same way. This is the territory of radical unknown. You no longer know what you want. You no longer know who you are. You no longer know where you're going. And the mind tries to react. It creates new goals, seeks new identities, clings to any trace of control. But something deeper refuses to be anesthetized again, refuses to accept a new superficial version of the self. That something is the soul, and it only operates in darkness, in silence, without shortcuts. Jung saw this moment as a sacred opportunity, but he warned, without symbolic courage, the individual gets lost, regresses, creates a spiritual persona, an ego disguised as awareness. That's why the crossing demands more than strength. It demands surrender. You cannot rush the void. It's not an obstacle. It is the psychic womb where the new begins to take form, but has no language yet. And that's the challenge, to remain, even when there are no guarantees that anything will come.
The void, in its essence, is not punishment. It is purification. It clears everything that is not essential. It dissolves the excess of identity, of expectation, of performance. But this process is not comfortable, because during the void, you realize that most of what you used to do was a way to avoid this very moment. the hyperactivity, the performative spirituality, the constant search for ready-made answers. All of it now reveals itself as distraction. And when these distractions lose their function, what remains is what was always there. Silence. Not an empty silence, but a silence full of demand. It doesn't speak, but it waits. It doesn't guide, but it watches. And slowly you begin to understand. This is the stage where nothing moves on the outside because everything is being remade on the inside. Jung spoke of the psychic incubation process, a time when consciousness must not be forced. The task is not to move forward, it is to wait for integration. And that's when the first signs of true transformation begin to emerge, not as ecstasy, but as sobriety, as a deep acceptance of what is, without embellishment, without premature hope, without symbolic escape. You begin to understand that meaning won't arrive wrapped in inspiring words. It will emerge slowly, in the body, in listening, in presence. It is in the depths of the void that the soul whispers for the first time, and what it says cannot be translated, only felt. After the silence, something erupts. Anger. But it's not ordinary anger. It is deep, ancient, sacred. It's not directed at someone. It's directed at everything you had to abandon within yourself to be accepted. At the system that taught you to be quiet, to comply, to mold yourself. And more than that, it's anger toward adaptation itself. You feel anger for how far you strayed from your truth in exchange for validation. Anger for playing roles that were never yours. Anger for having learned to ask permission just to exist. This anger is not regression. It is recovery. It marks the moment when the body remembers what the spirit forgot, that you have limits, that your desires are legitimate, that you have a voice. Jung said that repressed anger is one of the greatest gateways to the shadow, not because it's dangerous, but because it holds unrecognized vital energy. And when this energy starts to rise, it doesn't ask for explanation. It demands space. Caution is needed here, not to repress, but to channel. Because this anger doesn't want revenge. It wants integrity. It wants to reclaim lost psychic territory. Territory where you went quiet, where you adapted, where you disappeared. And when you make space for that anger, without projection, without guilt, you begin to rebuild something that should never have been broken, the alliance between you and your own essence. After the collapse, the shadow, the void, and the anger, something calmer begins to emerge. The clarity of someone who stopped running. You are no longer trying to awaken. You are living awake. And that's the difference that changes everything. Awakening is not a peak. It's not an emotional high. It's not a permanent illumination. It's a posture.
A way of existing that does not demand certainty to move forward, that does not seek validation to remain whole, that no longer needs to prove anything, not to others, not even to itself. Jung said that the mature individual does not seek perfection, but wholeness. And living awake is this, knowing that contradictions, fears, and limitations still exist, but no longer lying about them.
You begin to move with more calm, speak less than you know, listen more than you want to. You act from what is essential, not for impact, but for coherence. The new you doesn't need to be extraordinary. It needs to be real. And that's why it frightens, because the world is used to polished, efficient, seductive versions. But awakening doesn't offer that. It offers a human being who feels deeply and doesn't pretend otherwise. A human being who knows life is ambiguous, imperfect, impermanent, and still commits to truth. Living awake isn't about having more light. It's about having less fear of the dark. We live in an age of excess of stimulus, excess of performance, excess of noise. And in this context, true awakening is not encouraged. It is silenced, because those who truly awaken do not consume the same way. Do not blindly follow patterns. Do not adapt just to belong. Contemporary culture rewards adjustment, repetition, productivity dressed up as purpose. And that's why awakening, the one Jung described as the individuation process, is met with suspicion, because the individual who becomes themselves is unpredictable, uncontrollable, free. Carl Jung understood this risk. He saw that society, by imposing collective models of normality, suffocates the psychic uniqueness of each person. That's why he didn't see awakening as a state of bliss, but as a hard and ongoing psychic labor. A solitary path where one must have the courage to walk against the current, to face their own shadow without glamour, to hold the discomfort of no longer fitting in. Today, more than ever, awakening is a revolutionary act, not for defying external systems of power, but for deactivating the internal system of self-deception. In a time where everyone is shouting, awakening is listening. Where everyone is exposing themselves, awakening is retreating. Where everyone is reacting, awakening is integrating. Because those who truly awaken no longer need to prove they've awakened. Their very presence carries the evidence. You weren't trying to become someone new. You just wanted to stop lying to yourself. And now, there's no going back. The character has dissolved. The illusion has lost its power. The shadow has been seen. The silence accepted. The anger integrated. The void crossed. You no longer need to run, no longer need to prove, no longer need to be understood. Because now you hold something that doesn't rely on language. You hold presence. Presence not as a technique, but as the natural consequence of someone who stopped running from their own soul. You survived the crossing, not because you conquered the pain, but because you stayed when it felt unbearable. That night, I understood everything. And ever since, whenever the world feels heavy, I return to the fire. See you soon.